Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Sukkah. We are up to Perek Bet Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. The Mishnah discusses several kinds of unusual sukkahs. The Mishnah begins Hasomech Sukkato Bekarei Amita Kshera. If one supports a schach of his sukkah with the boards of a bed, meaning the bed is outside the sukkah and the schach is supported by one of the ends of the bed frame, the Mishnah says the sukkah is valid. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, but Rabbi Yehuda says, Imena yechola la'amod b'fnei atzma pesula. If the sukkah cannot stand on its own without the support of the bed, it is invalid because it is not as sturdy as required. Now the commentators explain that sukkah will not remain standing for long because the bed is likely to be moved, causing the sukkah to collapse. It is therefore invalid according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that a sukkah must have some permanence. Now, the Tanna Kama, however, rules that it is valid because, in his opinion, a sukkah is meant to be a temporary dwelling. And the Rav does tell us, Ven alachat Rabbi Yehuda, the alachat does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. The Mishnah's next two cases involve schach that lets in a great deal of sunlight. Sukkah ham duvlelet, a sukkah that has more sunlight than shade because its schach is uneven, meaning instead of the schach being in one flat layer, it is split into two layers with every other piece of schach at one height and all the remaining pieces at another height. This would be diagram brought down in note 3 and the article elucidated. And a sukkah whose schach is very sparse, yet its shade is greater than its sunlight. Kshera. In each of these cases, the sukkah is valid. In the first case, where the schach is uneven, the sukkah is valid because we view the schach as though it were flat. Now, during most of the day, when the sun shines in the sukkah at an angle, the sukkah has more sunlight than shade because the light shines through the gaps between the two levels of schach. The sukkah is nevertheless valid at all times because schach is judged by how much shade it provides when the sun is directly overhead. Since at that time the sukkah has more shade than sunlight, it is valid even during the rest of the day. In the second case, where the schach is sparse, the sukkah is valid because the solid parts of the schach cover a greater area than the gaps. Now, the Mishnah teaches that even though the schach is so thin and sparse that it can easily be blown away by the wind, the sukkah is valid as long as it has more shade than sunlight. Now, when the Mishnah says shade and sunlight, it refers not to the shadows and sunlit areas on the floor of the sukkah, but to the solid schach materials and gaps on the top of the sukkah. If it were referring to the shadows and sunlit areas on the floor, it would not require the shade to be greater than the sunlight, for even if they were equal, the sukkah would be valid. So again, the Mishnah is referring to the solid schach materials and gaps on the top of the sukkah. Now the Mishnah turns to the opposite case where the schach is very thick. Ham ube chimin bait, a sukkah that is densely covered with schach like a house. Af al pi she'en hakochavim nir'im mitocha kshera. Even though stars cannot be seen from inside it, it is valid. Now, even though the schach resembles the roof of the house, which is biblically invalid for sukkah, the rabbis did not disqualify it. It is preferable, however, that the schach be laid in such a way that stars can be seen through it. And that is the end of Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel now deals with 4 cases of a sukkah that is not built on the ground. Now, it says Sukkato berosh ha'agala. If one makes a sukkah on top of a wagon, or berosh ha'sfina, or on top of a boat on the sea, kshera, it is valid because despite its instability, it is considered a dwelling place. Now, although a sukkah and a wagon can be moved from place to place, and a sukkah and a boat at sea can be blown down by an average sea wind, they are regarded as places where people would dwell. Despite the fact that they are dwellings of a temporary nature, they are valid sukkah, since a sukkah is meant to be a temporary dwelling in any event. However, the sukkah and the boat must be strong enough to withstand an average wind on land, which is weaker than an average wind at sea, because otherwise it would not be considered even a temporary dwelling. Berosh ha'elan, if one makes a sukkah on top of a tree, ve'olin lah biyom tov, we skipped the line, right? The Mishnah says if one makes a sukkah on top of a wagon or on top of a boat on the sea, it is valid. Ve'olin lah biyom tov, and we may go up into it on Yom Tov. Now the Rav explains that this ruling is obvious. It's stated only for a stylistic balance with the Mishnah's next ruling when we say we may not go on Yom Tov. Let us read. Berosh ha'elan, if one makes a sukkah on top of a tree, he constructed a floor on the tree, built walls around it and covered them with schach, or al gabei gamal, or on the back of a camel, meaning he built walls between the camel's humps and covered them with schach, kshera, it is valid. Ve'en ulin la b'yom tov, but we may not go up into it on Yom Tov because it is forbidden to use the tree or the body of a living animal on Yom Tov. The rabbis prohibited using a tree, sitting or putting things on it on Shabbat and Yom Tov because they were concerned that one might pull off a branch which is biblically forbidden. Similarly, they prohibited using the body of a living animal on Shabbat and Yom Tov because one might pull off a tree branch with which to prod the animal. This is Gemara Betzah, page 36b. For this reason, one may not use a sukkah that is supported by a tree or an animal. The sukkah itself, however, is valid and may be used on Chol Moed. It's just that on Yom Tov, one may not use a sukkah that is supported by a tree or an animal. Now, the Mishnah limits its ruling to its ruling that a sukkah and a tree may not be used on Yom Tov. Shtayim ba'ilan v'achad b'dei adam. If two walls of the sukkah rest on the tree and one is man-made, meaning it's built on the ground, so the sukkah has three walls. Two of the walls and most of the floor rest on the tree. The third wall is a tall board that stands on the ground. It supports the sukkah floor and rises above it. On that side, therefore, the sukkah rests on a ground-based wall rather than on the tree. This would be diagram A, brought down in note 6. In the art school we said it. So the Mishnah says, or if two walls are man-made, built on the ground, and one rests on the tree, so two ground-based walls next to each other support most of the sukkah floor, only the third wall and the remainder of the floor rest on the tree. This would be diagram B. In the art school we said it, note brought down in note 7. Kshera, the sukkah is valid, but we may not go up into it on Yom Tov, since neither of these two sukkahs would remain standing if the tree were taken away. Going up into them means using the tree, which is forbidden on Yom Tov. Even in the second case, where two of the walls rest on the ground, only one rests on the tree, the sukkah would collapse if the tree would be removed, because the sukkah floor cannot be supported by just two adjacent walls. Shalosh b'dei adam v'achad ba'ilan. However, if the sukkah has four walls, three of which are man-made, built on the ground, and one rests on the tree, kishera ve'olin la b'yom tov. The sukkah is valid, and we may go up into it on Yom Tov. In this case, where the sukkah is supported by three walls that are built on the ground, it does not need the support of the tree at all. Therefore, one who goes up into the sukkah is not considered to be using the tree. However, one may not climb up the tree because that is a direct use of the tree. Rather, one must access the sukkah by some other means, such as a ladder. Now, the Mishnah gives a rule for determining whether sukkah built on a tree may be used on Yom Tov. Zaklal, this is the rule. Kol shenita la'ilan v'chola la'amod b'fnei atzma. In every case where the sukkah is built in such a way that even if the tree were removed, it would stand on its own. Kishera v'olin la b'yom tov. It is valid and we may go up into it on Yom Tov. The Mishnah adds this rule to teach that even if the sukkah has only two walls based on the ground, but they are opposite each other and not next to each other at right angles, the sukkah may be used on Yom Tov since it would remain standing even if the tree is taken away. This would be diagram C, brought down in note 10 and the arts elucidated. That is an Abotayev, that is Mishna Yomi. Everybody share Erev Shabbat Shalom. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.